Hello, thank you for tuning in to our podcast Tech Talk by GSDC, where we bring you thought-provoking conversations to discuss with inspirational industry expert leaders. My name is Taylor, and today we will be listening to two brilliant guests on the topic instructional designs in learning.
Welcome to this conversation. We are really honored to be part of GSDC's podcast series. My name is Jerry Zandstra. I am the Senior Director of Learning at a company called Ingenuiti. It's a company of a couple of hundred people, all dedicated to learning and translation, and then people placement. So we have offices around the world, in the United States in multiple places, in the Philippines and in Costa Rica. We've got a dedicated team, and and it's my honor to lead the learning side of it. I've been in learning, training, and development with adults in some form or another for more than 30 years. And I'm joined today by somebody who is a colleague and a very good friend and has been a friend of mine for a long time, Miriam Taylor. Miriam, can you give a little bit of your background?
Sure, thanks, Jerry. Yeah, so I've been in education too for close to 30 years as well. Spent a lot of time, I taught high school for a while.
Despite the fact that you're like 20 years younger than me, right?
I know that's very gracious, but not true.
Okay.
But yeah, spent time at multiple companies, growing and leading the learning teams, doing various things, and in the corporate space, but also in higher ed and in K-12, and some nonprofit work. So it's exciting to join you today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. And what's your role at Ingenuiti?
So I am a client success manager, which means my job is to make sure that we design the right learning solutions, that they are meet the needs of the client, that they excite them, that they're beyond what they were expecting, and to make sure the process goes smoothly, and to make sure that they want to continue to use Ingenuiti as their learning provider.
Great. All right, well, let's dive into the questions. How can instructional designers use cognitive science principles to design more effective learning experiences? So, I mean, you've designed at every single level, as you said, from K-12 to some of the largest corporations in the world. How do you want instructional designers, how are you trying to lead instructional designers to think about cognition and cognitive science?
Yeah, I mean, this question could take the rest of the podcast. So I have chosen probably 4 or 5 topics, or just simple cognitive strategies. So I do think it's important that if our listeners haven't spent any time studying cognitive science, to at least look at sort of maybe some simplified explanations of it, because there's a lot of miscommunication, or I'd say maybe misinformation, in the instructional design world. And I think cognitive science, when you sort of look at those principles, it's a really good resetting point, just to remind us about what we actually know from science about the brain versus sort of trendy things that kind of come and go. So a couple of them, something that I think is hugely important is just activating prior knowledge. And that gets missed a lot. I mean, how many times have we jumped into some sort of learning experience and it's just go from the beginning, here's what you need to know from a fire hose, and nobody bothers to say, well, if you already know these things, you could jump ahead, or here's a brief review, or here's why this is important. So just making sure to activate prior knowledge really engages the brain, and it helps us make those connections in the brain from what we already know to what we're about to learn, which of course improves retention, and that's really important.
So if you can add on, so if you can sort of add to what somebody already, so they've got an established base of knowledge of something, right? It's almost never zero.
Right.
And if
absolutely.
you can sort of build on to that. So yeah, I think scaffolding and so on. So how do you take the base that you have, and how do you keep adding to it?
Right. And then also, like, scaffolding is actually a separate principle. Also, like, chunking your material. We've all done that. I mean, I already mentioned a fire hose, making sure that the material is easy to read and in small enough bites that it's easy enough to retain. A couple other ones that I think should be self-explanatory, but I understand often projects are kind of, we needed them yesterday. So one of the things that's really important for a cognitive strategy is giving good feedback. As a learner, they don't want to just know whether they got it right or wrong. They need to know why. And actually that creates a fantastic formative assessment loop where the learner is seeing why they got it wrong, or maybe they were mostly right, but tweaking it a little bit and redoing it again. And so then again, we're speaking to good retention. And I guess just one more, I mean, I don't know, there's like 15, 20 off the top of my head. We're obviously not going to talk about all those, but cognitive load, I think, is something that often gets missed because, especially the world we live in, you know, I want information right now, and I want it to be wildly entertaining. And what happens often when we design learning is that we sort of buy into all of those principles and we start throwing stuff at learners so fast, and maybe it is more engaging. But the audio is coming and I have stuff flying across my screen and I'm supposed to be making choices and there's words appearing and you're really overloading your brain. And so there are very specific principles to cognitive load. And I won't get into all of those, but it's important to make sure that we're providing the right amount of audio that's aligned to what might be appearing on the screen, and that our interactions are appearing at a time that allows the learner to sit and think for a moment. So those are just some, obviously, there's a lot more. But.
Yeah, cognitive load is an interesting concept. I find as I get older, I read more slowly. It takes more time, and it's not because it's not some mental deficiency, right? It's that I actually want to take the time to think through something. I look up far more words than I used to, or principles, or people. I read a lot of biographies and or autobiographies, and I think, oh, I don't know anything about that person. And so my reading has become much slower, but my retention level is way higher. I'm not just like eating, right? I'm not just gobbling down food. I'm actually taking time to process it and to taste it. Yeah. So cognitive. What do you? I think I know your answer to this, but it was sort of all the rage for a while to have this idea that people learn differently or different styles of learning. That I'm this kind of learner, I'm that kind of learner. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty well been debunked, although, and I didn't want to call that out specifically, but that is definitely one of the sort of what's trendy. And I certainly understand in Gardner's learning styles, all of that. When it came about, I think it was important to call out that, especially when we talk about pedagogy, so for children and teenagers, you know, recognizing that one size doesn't fit all, and we all do have certain preferences of how we take in information, but honestly, the brain still processes information in the same way.
Right.
And so largely that's been debunked. Now, as a caveat, I would also say, right, like that doesn't mean that we can just, you know, we want to be cognizant of offering information in a variety of ways, but that's also to capture the interest and the motivation of the learner in whatever, you know,
for everybody, not that this slice is for this group, and that has become far too common. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to the hottest topic in learning, training, and development. Artificial intelligence, right? You know, how do instructional designers or learning experience designers leverage AI and artificial intelligence and machine learning to create personalized and adaptive learning experiences? I just finished a webinar last week on new technologies, AR and XR, augmented reality, virtual reality, and then artificial intelligence, and sort of how to think through those things. But that, I mean, it's literally been about a year since ChatGPT has been introduced, and it has terrified some people. I just, I think next week I'm publishing an article in Training Industry on not even how to use it, how to think about AI.
Right. That's that's what's key.
And I think right now it's a cool tool, but you know, it's somewhere between this solves every human problem that has ever existed to this is going to take over the world and destroy us all. Right.
Right.
And so it's and so we I don't even know that we know how to think about AI yet. And sort of there's differences in AI, right? Some AI is language generating, and so that's how most people experience it. But AI in visuals, in visual creation, in creating animations, in creating avatars that look remarkably real,
right,
and truthfully are just going to get more and more real. So, how do you think about AI? How do you when you think through this, what opportunities are there, and how should this tool, because that's what it is. It's not us. It's a tool that we as human beings use. So how do we as human beings use these tools?
Yeah, and I know you have some really good thoughts on this too. So I'll just hit a few. I mean, in terms of predictive AI, I am pleasantly surprised that if you look at a lot of LMS or LXP or whatever your company is using, and even for content creation, a lot of that is now woven in. And so we talk about predictive. I mean, the pretty cool thing is that we can, similar to Amazon, right? We can provide curriculums and we can provide courses for the learner that then based on what they're interested in, the AI is going to predict what would come next or based on what their scores are. So we get this content personalization. Now those are through the systems, right? But those
that's a system of it. It's not creating the content. It's telling you what does the learner need or want, right? And those are wonderful tools.
Right, because that provides personal learning pathways. I mean, we know as we look at the research that, whether I don't necessarily want to say generationally, but we have seen studies, millennials, Gen Z, and even others are looking for engagement in where they work. They're looking for the opportunity to learn and grow. And for companies that don't offer that, that's a scary thing because they'll often leave and go somewhere else. And so if you can provide that through your learning, the curriculum that you're providing, the content that you're providing to your employees, that's a huge asset. And a lot of, that all had to be done sort of manually. A lot of that can be done now, generated through AI, but there's a whole other aspect of it, right? Like the generative, and I find I use it a lot in terms of, I know instructional designers often get large quantities of source material dumped on them. And again, as an instructional designer, learning experience designer, you're not a subject matter expert. You try to be, but so you're trying to process all of this, speaking of cognitive load, right, for the first time. So AI does a great job of synthesizing all that down for you, maybe into like an outline or making sense of it. Now, it's not going to do your job, nor should it, right? So the point then of learning experience designer is at least they have a first step. Now they can take it and design an experience or make more sense of that content. And that's where I've seen it become very useful in terms of generating based on content that's been put into it, whether it's ChatGPT or something else.
Yeah. We're our instructional design team, as you know, is on the path to learning what it does well and what it does not do well, because there are certainly some things it does not do well. And it's funny for my first ChatGPT experience, I think probably was asking it to write a poem about my wife, and I was like, "Well, that's just wonderful. It rhymes. And then I read it, and it's like, it doesn't really capture. I mean, it gave me a place to start, but it doesn't capture the essence, right, of what I'm trying to communicate. Well, there is much to discuss on AI, but I think particularly in the idea of creating the sort of that path, right? That adaptive, personalized. That's a wonderful place to look at. What are the best practices for designing inclusive and accessible learning experiences for learners and for students? But with a caveat, because Ingenuiti does an enormous amount of work in trying to be inclusive, and inclusivity includes things like accessible language, that the voiceover, that So we work with a lot of multinational companies. We look for colors and symbols and stories and global themes, right? There's a lot of work to go into not just translation, but what we call localization, which would be familiar to many of our listeners. But what we want to talk about is how do you design that inclusive and accessible experience for learners, for students with disabilities?
Right. And really, I think, and that is the focus of the question. But to your point, Jerry, really, it is always the larger conversation. Like, we want to make sure that we're focusing on it for every learner. And so, again, to your point, no matter who's coming into the learning experience, are they seeing, I think we often sort of end on images, right? But more than images, are they hearing stories that are indicative of their experience? Is the terminology, or it's very easy to fall into idioms and things like that. Are those things things that would make sense in that culture? So that piece, I think, is important regardless, right? You have to know your learner, and to me, that's like the bottom line. If I don't know who my learner is, I can make all sorts of mistakes. But if I have a very clear view of who my learner is, then I can adapt it to what is best for them. So I mean, I think a thing that obviously we talk about accessible content, and we have to have web accessibility. So that's everything from making sure that the colors, that the white space is clean and easy to see, that, I have my images also have the description for someone who, so my screen readers can call those out. But I think a piece that often gets missed beyond that, though, is that we sort of focus on that screen, or maybe we focus on sight or the hearing aspects of it. What we forget to do is, if we're designing assessments, we often forget to design assessments that allow for multiple means of expression, which means if I ask you to tell me, your understanding of something, you're probably, because I know you well enough, you're going to reference a book or something that you read. But if I ask someone else to tell me how they know that, and where they might tell me they watched a YouTube video, and so I think that sometimes gets missed when we design the learning. We say, like, write in a paragraph or take this multiple choice test to show us that you mastered, as opposed to record some audio, explain this to me, or take a short video. So I think in the UDL, it's just universal design for learning, and we could obviously spend a long time on this, but I just want to make sure, we're always trying to think of not just sort of those visual aspects, because I think that's often what it's easiest to focus on, right? But that we're looking at the actual content, we're looking at the assessment pieces, that those all are inclusive of anyone who would be taking the learning. Yeah,
good.
How can instructional designers use data and analytics to identify learning gaps? And a lot of, again, we talked about LMS or other delivery systems. They have the ability, they pull so much data. But it's always, in my mind, it's hard to make sense of the data. So how can an instructional designer really use that data in the right way and analytics to figure out where those learning gaps are?
Yeah, so you can quickly be overwhelmed, right? You can be underwhelmed by data. You can be overwhelmed by data. You can die of thirst or drowned in it, and that's the challenge. So part of it is identifying the data that you really want, that you really need, and then putting it together in a way that's meaningful. And usually we think of the data coming from the learner, and so that's a little bit myopic. You need a broader perspective than that, because data is going to come from the learner. It comes through the LMS. It comes through engagement. It comes from, assessment questions. You get a bunch of that stuff. I think, though, looking at that isn't going to tell you everything you need. It might tell you, and then you can layer over the top of that some surveys. Right. So now you found out how they perform. Now you found out something about how they enjoyed the experience of performing. Right. And those are helpful things. Right. But it doesn't necessarily mean you've moved the ball, right? So you have to start that there's been an improvement. At the end of the day, what you're looking for is a change in behavior that moves the needle in the direction that the company wants to go. the organization wants to go. So sometimes you can move the needle, you're going in the wrong direction. So you have that data that comes from the learner. You have, I think, data that comes from the learning team, but there's another set of data that gets ignored. And that data set is, what is your organization attempting to do? I had a conversation in the last few months with a vice president of learning of a very large organization. And I asked her, what are the top 3 things that your organization, a publicly traded company, that your publicly traded company is attempting to do? She said, well, I don't really know. And I said, well, have you read a quarterly report, right? You're a publicly traded company. You have quarterly reports. Have you read the annual report? I mean, have you sat down with your you're in that stratosphere. Have you sat down with the chief operating officer and said, what 3 things are most important to you right now? So part of the data needs to come from the learners. Some can come from LMS systems and a variety of systems. Some can come from surveys. Some can come, it's a great data point to ask the people who create the learning, what do you actually think of it?
Yeah.
And you know, you and I have both heard, well, they won't tell us the truth. Yeah, they will. They definitely are going to tell you the truth. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, how does that data mix in with the data that you've learned, which there's a lot of it from the corporate side, or if it's a nonprofit, from the board side? What are you attempting to accomplish? Mm-hmm. When you can merge those 3 things in together, I think it tells you not only how you've done, how you're doing, but also where you should go next. But to do that, you need to be really attentive to data. And again, like all topics, right? We not only could we have, you and I have spent a lot of time talking about this, but look, at least clarify your sources of what you're attempting to capture, and then what are the most important ones, and then start looking at how do they touch each other, or how do they miss each other.
No, that's great. And I think kind of an interesting thing we've seen, right, the evolution of the chief learning officer, or like the VP of learning, those roles in the last probably 5 years. I mean, that was not a position before. And I think even now, sometimes people in those roles have to fight for access, or have to fight for a seat at the table a little bit.
They do.
Or are just not used to having that seat at the table. So I can see why maybe there's never either the question or the thought to, well, let's go higher. You know, let's talk to my COO. But that's something, to your point, that's hugely important. And I would say too, just even in terms of justification for your learning and development team, right? Like you need to be able to prove that what you're doing is totally tied into the goals of the company.
ROI, right? Return on investment.
Absolutely.
And with that, we will end. Miriam, thank you for your time, and GSDC, thank you for the opportunity. These are just the conversations Miriam and I have all the time. We're just happy that you could sit in and listen in on them. And we hope this has been useful to you. Thank you.
That was Miriam Taylor and Dr. Jerry Zandstra with such an insightful discussion. We will be bringing you more exceptional conversations. Look forward to Tech Talk by GSDC Podcast every Saturday on our YouTube channel. Do subscribe to stay updated.